We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Hello, my name is Paul Hellyer, and I am a former Minister of National Defense for Canada. I have just written an autobiography titled Hope Restored. This is my 15th and final book. My two latest, Light at the End of the Tunnel, A Survival Plan for the Human Species, and The Money Mafia, A World in Crisis, were designed to provide you with quite a bit of information that you were unlikely to get from newspapers, radio, or television. Hope Restored is different. The first 15 chapters are about my life from birth until my final departure from partisan politics in 2004. The remaining 10 short chapters are an abridged version of the broader reality, as I call it, in the 13 years from 2005 until 2018. The broader reality includes subjects like unidentified flying objects, or UFOs as they are known, a little bit about the visitors from other planets and star systems, and our interactions with them, as well as the extent to which we may have sold our souls to gain access to their incredible technology. I also discuss the origin of the universe and the spiritual battle between the forces of light and those of darkness, and the extent that the United States, as well as much of the world, may be threatened by a fascist New World Order.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
If you are naive and uninformed about these subjects, as I was 13 years ago, I would urge you to start reading at chapter 16 and leave the early chapters until later. If, on the other hand, you are well-read and up to speed on ufology, alien technology, and the 70-year cover-up of the most unbelievable escalation of militarism in history, you can start with chapter 21 and carry on from there. Above all, I hope you will listen to all that I have to say, because, without being too melodramatic, your very life may depend on it. To begin, I will review the highlights of my 13-year postgraduate journey, even though it is impossible to do it justice in 60 minutes. I was aware of the acronym UFO when I was Minister of National Defense. The Air Force provided me with sighting reports where about 80% of incidents were ticked off as natural phenomena of one kind or another. The remaining 20% were literally unidentified objects, UFOs for short. This experience was very similar to that in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. If I hadn't been so busy unifying the Navy, Army, and Air Force into a single Canadian Armed Forces, I might have thought of some questions to ask. But I was preoccupied, and UFOs were not really on my radar beyond taking a day off to dedicate the world's first flying saucer landing pad in St. Paul, Alberta, during Canada's centennial celebration in 1967. Like most of you, I gave the subject little or no thought for about 35 years after leaving the Department of Defense to become Minister of Transport. In about 2003, a young bilingual Canadian from Ottawa, Pierre Junot, began sending me information on the subject of UFOs. I told him, Pierre, I don't have time to read it. But he was patient. Pierre also asked me to watch an ABC 2-hour special on the subject. I remember thinking that there was no reason for the former military and civilian pilots and traffic controllers and policemen to say that they had seen UFOs if they hadn't. At about the same time, Pierre sent me a book. It was titled The Day After Roswell by Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso, retired, United States Army. I thought it would make good summer reading. But when I looked for it in the summer of 2004, I couldn't find it. So I had to settle for The Life of Pi instead. It was difficult to know until near the end of it whether it was fact or fiction. In 2005, I was looking for another book that I couldn't find, but there, staring me in the face, was The Day After Roswell. I decided that would be my holiday book at a rental lodge, the little family resort that I and my family ran for 60 years, ending in 2018. I was about 2/3 of the way through the book and had already concluded that, unlike The Life of Pi, it was based on fact, not fiction, because I recognized the names of some of the generals and many of the air bases that I knew when I was Minister of National Defense. About that time, my nephew Philip came along and asked me what I was reading. When I told him, he said, "Well, I'm a skeptic." "You are entitled to be a skeptic," I responded. "It's still a free country, more or less." Regretfully, like our American cousins, we have been losing our fundamental freedoms in the interim. Philip went home the next day, I think it was, and later he phoned me and said, "When I told the general you were reading The Day After Roswell," he said, "every word is true and more. Where can I get a copy of the book?" The general was a retired United States Air Force officer that Philip had met when they were both working in the aviation industry, and who I had met casually on one occasion. By the time I had finished reading the book, I was not only convinced that it was substantially true, but that it raised huge issues that not only the people of the United States who are paying the bill should know about, but all Earthlings, because we are all passengers on the same planet. Coincidentally, two ufologists, Mike Bird and Victor Vigiani, had invited me to speak at their Exopolitics Toronto conference on September the 25th, 2005. One of my many sins is procrastination, and I just hadn't bothered to let them know that I wasn't a ufologist and would not be accepting their kind invitation. I called the invitation a coincidence, but I don't really think it was. I think the Creator had been looking for someone to tell the people the truth about facts that their governments were hiding from them, and was recruiting me to join the small but growing army of truth-sayers. There were two impediments. I was marrying Sandra Bussière, the widow of my longtime best friend Bill Bussière, on Saturday, October the 1st, exactly 1 week after the conference. So I phoned Sandra and explained that I felt a responsibility to speak out and that it would be just a one-time affair. I can honestly say that I had absolutely no comprehension of the magnitude of my miscalculation on that point. Sandra was certainly not wildly enthusiastic, but gave me permission to go ahead if I thought I had a responsibility to speak out. Second, although there was absolutely no doubt in my mind, I thought it would be wise to verify the facts beyond one impressive TV broadcast, one fascinating book that I was sure was substantially correct, and one telephone conversation confirming its validity. I didn't doubt Philip's report, but it was nevertheless second-hand. So I asked him to give me the General's telephone number and a heads up that I would be calling. When I dialed and the General answered, he didn't even give me time to say, "Hello, how are you?" His very first words were, "Every word is true and more." The exact same response he had given to Philip. The General then spent 20 minutes, to the extent that he was comfortable with his oath of office, explaining the more. This included the fact that there had been direct face-to-face meetings between United States officials and visitors from other star systems. With this 100% confirmation, I phoned Byrd and Vigiani and told them I would speak at their conference. I was in Muskoka, so I returned to Toronto and dashed off a few words about my deeply held concerns of possible future conflict in space. I ended by saying, and I quote, "UFOs are as real as the airplanes flying overhead," end of quote.
UFOs are as real as the airplanes that fly over your head. That is my unequivocal conclusion.
This gave me the dubious distinction of being the first person of cabinet rank in the then G8 group of countries to state that fact categorically. My statement was acknowledged by the press, but it was something of a two-day wonder. What it did provoke, however, was an avalanche of written material from ufologists of several countries. Some was classified, some was not. Then there were the books I received, dozens of them. And in those early days, I read every one of them. Briefings followed from some of the world's best ufologists. The first was Dr. Stephen Greer, who deserves a special medal for dedication and devotion.
Members of the press, the American public, and people of the world. We are here today to disclose the truth about a subject that has been ridiculed and questioned, denied for at least 50 years.
Others included Paula Harris, Stephen Bassett, Michael Salas, Linda Moulton Howe, and the list goes on, including a number of retired U.S. military officers. I learned that there had been crashes before July 1947. But this one near Roswell, New Mexico, took on the aura of the watershed that changed history and really marked the beginning of the space age. One of the top secret documents that I didn't see when it was written on September the 15th, 1969, by Wilbert Smith, a senior employee of the Canadian Department of Transport, of which I later became minister, was the following. Smith had obtained the information through the Canadian Embassy in Washington. First, flying saucers exist. The matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States, higher even than the H-bomb. Their modus operandi is unknown, but a concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. Finally, the entire matter is considered by United States authorities to be of tremendous significance. Well, that was the absolute truth in September 1969. This story will end with what I and many others believe to be the absolute truth in September 2018. To say that there is a world of difference would be a masterpiece of understatement. The sad and shocking truth is that the world faces an unknown and unprecedented crisis. Little of the background had leaked into the public domain. President Truman established a small group called the MJ-12, Majestic 12, to have absolute authority over all matters related to the extraterrestrials and their technology. Truman also asked Congress to pass the National Security Act to keep all of their decisions secret. This was reasonable at the time because the US wasn't sure how much information the Soviets knew. When the Berlin Wall came down, would have been the time to open the books and let the world in on the secrets. But that did not happen. The MJ-12, or augmented MJ-12, decided to maintain its near-perfect truth embargo, backed by extraordinary penalties for even a minor breach. This has been a curse of unprecedented magnitude. As early as October 1940, years before Germany surrendered to the Allied armies to vaporize Hitler's vision of empire, the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations, CFR or Council, drafted a memorandum outlining a comprehensive policy, and I quote, to set forth the political, military, territorial, and economic requirements of the United States in its potential leadership of the non-German world, including the United Kingdom itself, as well as the Western Hemisphere and Far East. The U.S. Council on Foreign Relations wasn't the only group that was thinking ahead. Once the Soviets and Americans had joined the Allied cause, it wasn't long before ultimate defeat seemed inevitable. So key Nazis began to make an alternative plan. They established a base in Antarctica and sent many of their best scientists and engineers, along with all of the necessary support personnel, to a new alternative headquarters that they called the New Berlin. So when the war in Europe ended in June 1945, the German Nazis didn't really give up. They just surrendered and went underground to regroup and start on the long road back to military supremacy. In a stroke of unparalleled good luck for them, the United States started to recruit Nazi scientists to assist in the anticipated Cold War with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. President Truman approved the policy with the proviso that no one who had been active in the Nazi Party would be included. But, as happens all too often in negotiations between the military and their civilian superiors, Truman's condition was ignored. Consequently, many hardcore Nazis were brought to America, given new names and resumes, and then appointed to important military and civilian jobs. The range was broad and included not only rocketry, of which Wernher von Braun was the accepted genius, but also inevitably back engineering of space vehicles. And some of the generals, some of the Germans, had been involved in that field during World War II. This significant migration was called Operation Paperclip, that you can find on Google. It would be interesting to know whose idea it was to move the primary location for back engineering spacecraft to Nevada, in an area designated as Area 51, north of Las Vegas. It appears to have been done without the authority of the Commander-in-Chief, because President Eisenhower wanted to know what was going on out there, and the military refused to tell him. It was only when he threatened to send in the army from Colorado that they capitulated and allowed him to send 3 or 4 of his CIA friends to look around and report back. Their report, as anticipated, was that the principal activity was back engineering the saucer that had crashed near Roswell. While he was president, Eisenhower allegedly signed a document referred to as the Treaty of Grenada, allowing the gray aliens to kidnap a limited number of individuals for examination and genetics material that would permit the creation of a new, superior hybrid race. The agreed limits, apparently, were soon ignored, and no one in government has ever reported what has been going on. In his plaintive but prophetic final address to the nation, Eisenhower conceded that the ET file had fallen into the wrong hands, and the U.S. should beware of its military-industrial complex. It would now be called the Military-Industrial Intelligence Complex.
Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. Akin to and largely responsible for the sweeping changes in our industrial military posture has been the technological revolution during recent decades. In this revolution, research has become central. It also becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. A steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. Today, the solitary inventor, tinkering in his shop, has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
The President's swan song rang the warning bell of the ascendancy of an elite group that included the military and the beginning of the end of any semblance of democracy in the United States. The National Security Act allowed the adoption of a rule that forbade telling anyone anything unless the person had an absolute need to know. And this was interpreted to include the President and the Congress. Each new president was given a general briefing that included the number of alien species known to the military and the fact that they were benign, with the exception of one, which was usually unnamed. That one species has been assumed to be the reptilians in the absence of information to the contrary. Meanwhile, more thousands of Nazis were brought into the U.S. when Allen Dulles became head of the CIA, and his brother John Foster Dulles, was U.S. Secretary of State. These new migrations augmented the Nazi influence in many areas of the U.S., especially the CIA. When Allen Dulles was allegedly asked how he was able to sneak so many Nazis into the U.S., his answer was, and I quote, "Because Americans don't read books," end of quote. The same could be said about Canadians. You may ask who is running the United States if neither the President nor the Congress is in charge. The de facto government of the United States has passed into what I and others have called the cabal. This is an amorphous group that has joined forces over the years for probably no better reason than mutual self-interest. At the top of the heap on the civil side are the Bavarian Illuminati and perhaps the Thule Society, in concert with the Bilderbergers, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Trilateral Commission. In my books, I call them the Three Sisters due to their close ties and overlapping membership. They exercise power both collectively and as individuals in the following organizations. The top of the pyramid is the banking cartel. It runs much of the world and exercises indescribable power by deciding who prospers and who doesn't. Its well-entrenched system is rotten to the core and has enabled 62 families to accumulate 50% of the wealth in the whole world. Unbelievable. Next to the banking cartel is the oil cartel. It and the bankers, who are closely related, control the secret patents on zero-point energy that, if made available to the public, would have prevented the horrendous consequences of global warming. and still could reduce the worst which is yet to come. The oil cartel has spent millions trying to persuade the public that black is white, just as the tobacco companies did with tobacco. Close to the oil cartel, of which it is a part, are the transnational corporations, who exercise astronomical power in reducing competition, eliminating jobs, and raising prices. Just as Dr. David Korten warned many years ago, beware the day when the corporations rule the world. The next large group are the intelligence agencies, who have developed the means of monitoring us all. It is a long list who have taken away our freedom and made us helplessly vulnerable to their whims and plans. A few that are better known include the CIA, the FBI, NSA, the British MI6, and the Israeli Mossad. They have rigged a world where none of us are free to come and go as we please, except under the watchful eye of Big Brother. A Big Brother, incidentally, who not only establishes the rules, but develops the means of enforcing them. Finally, the cabal includes a very large slice of the United States military. They provide the muscle necessary to establish and maintain the New World Order that has been the cover story common to them all. What started out as a worrisome military-industrial complex has morphed into a military, industrial, intelligence, commercial, and financial complex so comprehensive that you can't move without coming into contact with one of its tentacles. When President H.W. Bush proclaimed the advent of a new world order, it sounded like the utopian dream of peace, goodwill, and justice for all humankind. But this new world order is not to be elected. It is to be imposed by whatever means necessary. It is to be a totalitarian government of, by, and for the elite groups responsible for its creation. Fascism, by whatever name you want to call it. We might have seen it coming if we had been blessed with a free press. For example, when the late Senator Daniel K. Inouye of Hawaii said, and I quote, "There exists a shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, and free from all checks and balances, and free from the law," end of quote. There was a day when he would have made headlines in all of the papers and begun a debate of genuine significance. The same would have been true when Sarah McClendon, a White House reporter, asked President Clinton why he didn't demand disclosure of the UFO phenomena. He replied, and I quote, "Sarah, there is a government within the government, and I don't really control it. The commander-in-chief of the most advanced armed forces in the world, and the man who has his finger on the atomic button, publicly admits that he doesn't have complete control over the forces which are supposed to be under his command. In anything but a controlled society, that would be enough to bring the roof crashing down." There had been strong signals that the military were usurping the civil responsibility for foreign policy as early as 1992. The Pentagon, under the supervision of Paul Wolfowitz, produced a document labeled Defense Planning Guidance, post-Cold War strategy, which later became known as a plan for a new American century. It was a very aggressive blueprint for military expansion that included a number of proposed wars in the Middle East. When the original draft was leaked to the New York Times in March 1992, the reaction was so negative that it had to be withdrawn and rewritten in more acceptable language. One of the suggestions in the original document was that the American people might be difficult to sell on such an aggressive interventionist policy in the absence of some incident, like another Pearl Harbor. The principal authors became key members of the George W. Bush administration, thanks largely to Dick Cheney and his transformation team. In due course, they got their incident like Pearl Harbor, when 2 airplanes flew into towers at the Trade Center in New York on September the 11th, 2001. The press dutifully reported what had happened, but no investigative reporters were assigned to determine how 2 planes, with neither the kinetic nor heat energy necessary to bring down even 1 building, were responsible for the destruction of 5. 1,000 architects and engineers were convinced that the official explanation was incorrect. The late Major General retired, Albert Stubelbein III, former chief of all of the U.S. Army intelligence services around the world, at his wife's suggestion, connected the dots and came to the very unhappy conclusion that the public had been duped. Totally convincing is Dr. Judy Wood's 500-page book entitled Where Did the Towers Go? Evidence of Directed Free Energy Technology on 9/11. She doesn't point fingers. She merely says, look at the evidence. And that advice should have been taken by people in high places. Meanwhile, the negative consequences for Americans and citizens of the world is probably unequaled in all of recorded history. In the real world of near total secrecy, the military-industrial intelligence group used the incident to justify a 100% increase in defense expenditures at a time when they were already twice as great as necessary to more than cope with any possible enemy. The Pentagon became careless in financial record keeping, to the point where Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld admitted $2 trillion were missing and unaccounted for. More recently, the figure for missing funds has escalated to 21 trillion. That figure was 21 trillion, not 21 billion. No defense department could get away with that in a democracy. Meanwhile, in the real world of near total secrecy of the shadow government or cabal or military-industrial intelligence group, whatever you want to call it, has built up military and lethal force short of war, unprecedented in the recorded history of planet Earth. I had not finished reading a book titled Under an Ionized Sky, From Chemtrails to Space Fence Lockdown by Alana Freeland when I wrote my book. Pity. If I had, I would have used much stronger language. I admit to being a grizzled old veteran politician who has been exposed to the best and the worst of new developments over the course of a long life. But I have never seen anything comparable to Alana's revelations. The indescribable list of projects that most of us have never heard of to intercept missiles in flight and give psychotic generals the false security that they could initiate a nuclear war and survive. Intercept friendly spaceships if they attempted to free us from our bondage. to alter the weather, and then to use it as a weapon. Worst of all, they have developed a worldwide network or fence that would allow them to harm or kill anyone, anywhere, anytime. No arrest warrant, no habeas corpus, no judge, no trial, just death at the whim of some unidentified person somewhere who has probably been the subject of mind control. I can only describe it as hell on earth. I can truthfully say that unless or until you read An Ionized Sky from Chemtrails to Space Fence Lockdown, you haven't a clue of what has been going on for decades, especially since September the 11th, 2001, and the fate that is being proposed for you. Perhaps you would prefer not to know, but that is a defeatist attitude. And I, for one, and there are thousands like me, know the game isn't over until it's over. It seems strange that I was led to title my book Hope Restored, but that is conditional. Of course we are aware of the obvious. We read constantly of the corruption and deception in government and industry, and of the new attempts to impose a white, male-dominated culture on a world of diversity. We see the love of power and money and lust supplant the desire to be concerned about the less fortunate. We know that in God we trust on money is a misnomer and should be replaced with, in technology, robots, and artificial intelligence we trust. We are aware of the terrible arms race and the determination of Russia and China not to be left so far behind that they are impotent against the even more dreadful killing machines. What we have not been aware of until now is that the concentration of evil is such that the future of the human species is at stake. That is the direction in which we are headed, and we could suffer the same fate as Mars, which was once a beautiful planet like ours, only to make its surface uninhabitable after getting involved in a nuclear war. Fortunately, God, who created the cosmos at the time of the Big Bang, is omnipresent and available to listen to any one of us at any time if we ask. He knows that there are literally millions of kind, compassionate, and loving earthlings, that they can be a catalyst for change. We have been given the power of free choice so we can write our own history. To begin, as a species, we must abandon our lust for warmongering, offense, and defense, and dedicate our hearts, energy, and resources to peacemaking at all levels. It applies to families, tribes, religions, nation-states, and alliances. All old gripes, grudges, insults, or atrocities, either real or imagined, must be forgiven, even if they cannot be forgotten. New and clean plates must be the order of the day. At or near the top of the list, the United Nations should convene a working Congress of the major religions of the world with an agenda of reconciliation and future cooperation in building the kingdom of God on earth. The atrocities being perpetrated on religious minorities are unspeakably evil and must end. They all profess adherence to some version of the Golden Rule of treating others as they would wish to be treated, but there are precious few examples of the principle being applied in practice. In the same vein, There cannot be a world of peace until the two major sects of Islam, Sunni and Shia, reach an agreement of total cooperation. They worship the same God and revere the same holy book, so it is totally inconsistent with those beliefs to use lethal force to achieve political dominance. Former U.S. Congressman Mark Siljander, who learned Arabic in order to be an ambassador of goodwill between Christianity and Islam, has agreed to recruit moderate imams from the Islam factions to form the nucleus of a peace and reconciliation project under the United Nations sponsorship. Centuries-old enmities will not dissolve quickly, but they must be reconciled as part of a new beginning, for the human species. One more flashpoint is the Israeli-Palestinian border dispute. Several attempts have been made to reach agreement, but without success. A just settlement is imperative if there is to be a lasting peace in the Middle East. There are 1,000 initiatives that can be taken to convert our species from one of pride and warmongering to one of peace, justice, love, and compassion. These can and should begin at once, so they can proceed simultaneously with a completely different list of urgent and essential actions to prevent the cabal from establishing a fascist dictatorship under the guise of a new world order. The situation in the world in 2018 is similar to the one that existed in 1939, with one critical exception. At that time, Hitler's military juggernaut was in full sight for everyone to see and to fear the ominous consequences. Today, the situation is even more frightening. The near-invincible military might of the Nazis does not consist of stormtroopers and tanks, fighter aircraft and missiles. The primary source of military power consists of an armada of spaceships equipped with weapons that make the ones used in World War II, prior to August 6, 1945, when the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, look like toys. President Eisenhower sounded the alarm in his final address to the nation when he warned Americans to beware of the military-industrial complex. It would have been helpful if his language had been more specific, because he already knew that the UFO ET file had fallen into the wrong hands. The extent to which this is true can be gauged by the fact that even though, as Dr. Michael Wolff explained, the underground base at Area 51 is a sprawling city the size of Rhode Island, and it continues to grow, with a sister base called S4 some 12 miles away, and another named Indian Springs. No American president has ever been allowed to visit or inspect it. The incredible fact that the President of the United States, who is legally the Commander-in-Chief of all its armed forces, has not been fully privy to the plans and projects of those forces is 100% proof that something smells in the heart of the Republic, and a faint whiff of that odor has just begun to be detected. I mentioned earlier that the power of the enemy within is almost invincible. The only hope lies in the word almost, quote unquote. Unlike the situation in the 1939, the idea of an extended mobilization would be ridiculous in the extreme. There are, however, steps that can be taken before and before the U.S. election, hopefully in November of 2018, that would prevent the Nazis from ever effecting their coup. And this is the final call to action stations. In my book, I give reasons for each of the proposed actions. Regretfully, there is insufficient time for that here. 1. An action plan for Americans to take back control of America. At the top of the list is the Central Intelligence Agency. It should be shut down immediately and totally. It has been the headquarters for the evil empire, at least at the covert level. It introduced torture, which is a tool of the one we call Satan. The CIA has engineered the policy of continual war. It has also, according to various accounts, been one of the biggest, if not the biggest, drug dealer in the United States of America. The CIA should be locked and shuttered before any documents can be removed or shredded. Employees should be given 3 months separation pay, and the organization and the inestimable damage it has done pass into history. Second, National Security Agency should be shut down at once, but only on an interim basis until the war is over. Putting the massive spy agency in mothballs will level the playing field and make it impossible for the Nazis to know who among their own ranks has opted to tell the truth and who has not. The massive spying organization will become inert until the situation has become sufficiently stabilized. That is, so that the Congress can decide how much universal spying should end and how many selective targets, if any, remain. Number 3, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, should be completely shut down until the Congress can examine and review all of its advanced projects from a moral and ethical point of view. Is DARPA involved in experiments to develop beings that are half human and half machine? Question mark. If so, what is the purpose of its experiments? And is it one that our Creator God would approve? The same question can be asked of artificial intelligence. Building robots to do the dirty work, like mining, for example, is perfectly rational. But why develop machines to do our creative thinking for us when we don't use the common sense that is part of our inheritance? Some of the projects that DARPA is alleged to be working on appear to be quite grotesque and totally out of sync with a world of peace, justice, and beauty. And that should be the standard by which the Congress should determine its suitability for public funding. Next, number 4, the Federal Reserve should, of all of the targets mentioned here, be on a par with the CIA. It must be nationalized at once before the congressmen and congresswomen start thinking about campaign funds for the 2020 election. In my book, I refer to the Fed as, quote, the biggest heist in history, end of quote. That is exactly what it is. The power to create money is the most valuable financial asset that any country possesses. Yet it was given away, yes, given away, to a handful of the richest bankers in the world. The legislation to establish the Fed was introduced just before Christmas, and the Congress may have had other things on its mind. But allowing this legislation to be passed and implemented was one of the most irresponsible actions imaginable. Congress must act immediately to right a 105-year-old injustice and dissolve the system that has given the cabal its nearly absolute power. Anyone who has read Lucifer's Banker by Bradley C. Birkenfeld will conclude that the present banking system is rotten to the core and should be redesigned from the ground up, preferably along the lines I have outlined in Chapter 21. It should also be recognized that international trade, despite its many benefits in providing a wide range of products to pander to many different tastes, is not an economic panacea. It might increase GDP infinitesimally if it results in increasing the velocity of turnover of the existing money supply, but generations of depressions, recessions, and austerity budgets are all due to inadequate domestic demand. And the only way of filling that perennial void is government-created money. Number 5, the chemtrail ionized sky duel. The US President should order the armed forces to cease and desist immediately from using chemtrails, this most evil of all projects. In one fell swoop, he would eliminate their ability to use weather as a weapon. Global warming is creating more than enough extreme variations in weather patterns without adding to it artificially. The devastating medical and health problems related to our daily dose of nanoparticles of aluminum, barium, strontium, and other unknown elements has already been noted in my book. It is about survival and the balance of power between nations and between the military and innocent civilians. The chemtrail harp fence has been designed to encourage psychotic generals into believing that the US could wage a nuclear war with Russia and suffer only acceptable casualties. This is sheer madness, of course, but when generals are subject to mind control, they cease to be rational. This same fence is designed to discourage any good ETs who might consider coming to our rescue from doing so. To the many countries, including Canada, who have been duped into believing that the chemtrails are related to climate control, I say, tear up your agreement with the US and act immediately. No need for studies or commissions or inquiries. The health and possibly the lives of your citizens are in danger until you end this horrific system. And number 6, ground the Space Command. The US President should issue an order grounding all space vehicles of every kind until the question of who will represent Earth in space has been agreed by all the major powers, including Russia and China. In particular, another arms race is inevitable in the absence of a diplomatic solution. Diplomatic solutions must become the norm. Certainly, the Nazi-controlled US fleet should sit on the ground until all crews have been screened for allegiance to the US Constitution and the people of the United States. Space travel offers an exciting new frontier, but we are not welcome in deep space until we abandon our frontier mentality of shoot first and ask questions after, which has been our modus vivendi until now. Number 7, ban automatic rifles, except for the military. I have added this one in honor of those wonderful young people who I admire so very much. They are concerned about their lives and safety, and so should we all be. It would be wonderful to outlaw the automatics, compensate the owners, and convert the metal into hand tools for the poor people of the world who need them most. The potential miracle can only happen from the bottom up. There is no way that America can be saved for Americans if you expect the miracle to begin at the top. It will only happen if many, many millions of ordinary Americans are sufficiently motivated to save their country from the Nazis that they contact the president, their congressman, or Congresswoman and their senator, if he or she is one of the 35 up for re-election, and say to each one of them, "We will vote against you, regardless of party, if you don't initiate and enact the agenda set out above before the election. Promises of action after the election won't do. Only action now will earn you my vote, because it is the survival of my country as an independent entity that is at stake." Finally, a joint congressional committee would be good. To set one up, establish it immediately to seek the truth in these matters. But first, it would be necessary to enact a general amnesty under the National Security Act. There are many patriots that would love to tell the truth, but the cost is too high without an amnesty. The revelations would only start when the new Congress has been sworn in. But what they learn and what they do with what they learn will determine the fate of America and, perhaps, the human species, or most of it.